Hello and welcome to the Carteret Cast, the podcast for everything Carteret County. Today I'm super honored to be here with Mr. Bob Guthrie, who's here to share a few of his stories about World War II and how it affected Carteret County. So, Mr. Bob, if you just want to introduce yourself a little bit and give us
Okay.
who you are and why Carteret County is so important to you.
Thank you. I'll be happy to do that. I'm a native son of Carteret County. I was born here in Morehead City. And after a teaching career, I decided I wasn't so happy sitting at home doing nothing, for anything other than myself. So I became involved in the museum here, and I became their docent. And I tell people all the time that I'm the best docent that the museum has, and I'm the worst docent that the museum has because I'm the only docent that the museum has. So at any rate, my job in the museum is when people come in and they want to know something about the things that we have here in the museum, I'm the person that gets to take them on a guided tour. My area of expertise is unofficially World War II. And the reason for that is because my father was very active in the Navy in World War II. He joined the Navy when he was 15 years old with a cousin, and that's another story that I will tell later. But my father received what was known as a 90-day deferred enlistment. That gave the Navy time to find out just how old he really was and to secure parental permission. Now, you could be in the Navy if you were 16, but if you were 15, you had to have parental permission to be in the Navy. The Navy had a tradition of taking very, very young boys into the Navy as cabin boys, but by this particular time, they wanted men who were a little bit older. So anyway, my father did eventually, and his cousin did eventually get into the Navy. My father was in the Navy, had been in the Navy since 1930, saw the Navy transform itself from the coal-fired Navy into the fuel oil-fired Navy. And so by World War II and by December 7th, 1941, the United States became involved in World War II. And I grew up a Navy brat. I learned at an early age to appreciate all things Navy. I made my father extremely unhappy one day when he had me on his lap and he asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. Now, what I said made him mad, but I thought I was on strong grounds because I always thought that the Marine Corps was the Navy's Army. But I said I wanted to be a Marine when I grew up. It didn't exactly make his day, and he left immediately, and my mother came over and said, "You could have said anything at all, and not upset your dad, but you said the one thing that would set him off." But at any rate, so over the next few podcasts, we're going to be talking about World War II, but today I want to tell you about 3 British sailors that are buried in Morehead City's Bayview Cemetery. They came on a ship called the San Delfino, which had been sent here. It was an armed merchant ship. Now, what that meant was it had been disguised as an armed merchant ship. It looked like an ordinary merchant ship, but if a U-boat attacked it, it could do 2 things. It could fire naval gunfire, and it could also drop depth charges. The 2 things that submarines are not so good at protecting themselves from. But unfortunately, on April 9th, 1942, it was torpedoed and sank, and all hands were lost. Some of the bodies washed up at Ocracoke and some at Hatteras, but 3 bodies washed up on Atlantic Beach. And they were brought to Morehead City, and they were buried here in Morehead. And the names of the 3, I can only tell you the names of 2. One was M. Jones, and we managed to find a list of the full complement, and his name was Maldwin Jones. and there was a young man. All these young men were 20 or younger.
Mhm.
Okay. The second person who was identified was a fisher, and his name was John Latto Fisher. The last of the ones buried there, his tombstone says known unto God. So we have no idea who he was. That particular date is on the tombstone, so it's considered their date of death. Rodney Kemp and Rodney is a good friend of mine. He's one of the local fish house liars and storytellers of Carteret County, and he came to me, and I was aware that there were 3 British sailors that were buried here, and we decided that from then on we were going to try to honor them every year on Veterans Day. Now, the reason why we chose Veterans Day, in Britain, Veterans Day is called the Day of Remembrance, and they only have one day in which they remember the deceased veterans. We have 2 days. We have Veterans Day and we have Memorial Day. So in Britain, they celebrate half the day is for living veterans. The second half of the day is for those who are deceased. And the Brits celebrate it quite well. I did some research to find out what the Brits would actually do for their people. And one of the things as I was surfing the internet that caught my eye was the description of the thing that was on the internet. It said, Day of Remembrance Celebration, Royal Albert Hall, London, England. Royal Albert Hall is a tremendous arena that has an open space in the middle of the arena, and then they have seats all around. It's a beautiful place. One end of it has an orchestra pit and a stage. And when I first tuned it in, I wasn't all that impressed with it because they were showing clips from the movie Battle of Britain, and I'd seen the Battle of Britain about 6 times by then. But I kept on watching, and it eventually turned into something quite different. The announcer said they were going to have a roll call. I didn't know what that meant, but I discovered the Royal Navy was called first. The band began to play, and in marched 150 ratings and officers of the Royal Navy, and they lined up in a line across the center section of the open space in the Royal Albert Hall. Then the announcer called the British Army. Now, the reason why the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy is always called first, is because it's the senior service in Great Britain. It's the oldest of the 3 services. The British Army is the second oldest. Another 150 or so officers and men came in, lined up behind the sailors. And then the Royal Air Force was called, and they lined up the last. And then the British Legion was called. The British Legion is like the American Legion. It's full of retired personnel, but they also come in, and mostly they sit in a separate place. And then the real exhibition began. A choir came in, they played a hymn, they had acolytes, crucifers, a bishop, and a worship service began. And while the choir was marching in, some of the sailors built an altar of drums, and in marched one military person who had a red leather book that he laid on the top drum, and in it were the names of all the active duty and the retired military who'd passed away that year. And from then on, I was enthralled with what happened. After the hymn was finished, they had some pronouncements. They had someone who'd received the Victoria Cross to recite a poem, and the final words of the poem were, "In the morning, in the evening, we will remember them." And then everyone in the building repeated that phrase. Then it got very quiet. I thought that I'd lost the sound and I was messing with the computer. And when I looked up, what I saw took my breath away. 1,000,000 poppy petals were falling from the ceiling. I couldn't help myself. I just I became very emotional. And then I was sort of beating myself up about being a crybaby. And the camera zoomed in on this British sailor, and he had medals going across his chest. And the tears were flowing down his face. And I said, if he can cry, I can cry. It really was a beautiful ceremony. Towards the end, they all stood up to sing God Save the Queen. She was the monarch then. And at the end, they all turned to face the royal box. And a sergeant major orders everyone to come to attention, and they orders them to take their hats off. And then he commands them to give 3 cheers for Her Majesty the Queen, and they do that. And then everybody goes home. But that's not the end. That's the day before the Day of Remembrance. During the day at Whitehall, which is a governmental center in London, they had the laying of wreaths at the cenotaph, which is this giant set of statues in the middle of the street. And the Queen always comes, and her family all participate, and they lay wreaths at this. And it's sort of another wonderful celebration of it. A lot of churches in Britain have people buried in the church, within the church, some under the floor of the church. In Westminster, as the Brits say, they don't say Westminster, they say Westminster. There is a section at the beginning of the aisle that enters the church that has flowers going all around it. And that's where the unknown soldier of Great Britain is buried. And people don't tread over that. They walk around it. Queen Elizabeth, when she was inaugurated, when she was married, and she was married there as well, as she and her husband were coming out the exit, she stopped and placed her bouquet of flowers on top of the grave there. And a lot of people will do the same thing as they march into. And the interesting thing is there's also a plaque there for Winston Churchill right in front of that. And it acknowledges his role as the leader of Great Britain during the World War II. The Brits were in the war long before the United States was. And that's another thing that I point out. One of the ministers of my church went to Great Britain, and when he came back, he said he wanted to see me in his office, and we sat down. And he said, "Bob, everywhere we went, they knew we were Americans, and they said, when you go back to the United States, please thank your people for saving us in World War II." And I looked at the preacher, and I said, "Preacher, could they not know that they had it exactly backwards? We didn't save them; they saved us." And a lot of people don't understand that. They say, "Well, we helped the Brits to win the war." We did help the Brits to win the war. But if the Brits hadn't resisted and remained in the fight, we would never have been able to have invaded France, and we would never have won World War II. We'd all, unfortunately, be either dead or speaking German now, and I'm glad that that's not the language I speak. But at any rate, I keep that in mind because I think we have a great debt that we owe the British for this. So one of the reasons why Rodney and I decided that we were going to honor these people is because of that debt, that we do have this. I want to mention a family in Morehead City, the Royals, Dr. Benjamin Franklin Royal and his wife, Miss Ann. Their son, Benjamin Franklin Jr., a Carteret County native, was killed in World War II. And I always thought it was interesting that at church we sat right behind the Royals. And I asked my grandmother why the Royals sat I knew why we sat where we sat, because my grandmother had to get out a lot of times to go help set communion. So she sat at the very back of the church. So anyway, she said, "Have you ever read the inscription of the stained glass window that's right beside us?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, go and read it." and it's the Nativity window, and it's given by Dr. Benjamin Franklin Royal and his wife, Miss Anne, to honor their son. After the war was over, Miss Anne Royal contacted the British Embassy to find out the families of the three boys that I mentioned that are buried there. She paid for their families to come to the United States to see the place where their sons are buried. That was a marvelous thing for her to do. You can tell I'm getting emotional again as I do. These people were heroes. And I tell this to all the young military people. We get a lot of Marines who volunteer here. And I always shake their hand and say thank you for putting the uniform of our country on and going out to defend it. And I don't know whether you know you were a hero, but you are a hero. And they look at me like I'm crazy. I'm not a hero. And I say, you don't understand. You put the uniform of our country on, that makes you a target to anyone in the world who does not wish our country well. So I take it very seriously that everyone who's put the uniform on, whether they were in a war or not, in a way they are heroic. And I tell people this. Now, the celebrations that we would have at the cemetery, we would spend, we begin about 10:30 on November 11th. And we would do 30 minutes for the Brits who are buried on the west side of Bayview Cemetery. And then we would go across the street, and the next 30 minutes would be dedicated to American veterans who are buried there. And we would always, we managed to get the Episcopal rector of St. Andrews, who plays the bagpipes. He would come and play the bagpipes for us. So we would always get a healthy dose of Amazing Grace and several other things. And you can play our national anthem on the bagpipes. It doesn't sound as good as it does with a big brass band, but it will pass, you know. So we're very happy to have his presence with us. But we take it very seriously. Well, the first time we did it, we hadn't sort of planned everything that happened, and we ended up with some time on our hands. And Rodney, thinking quickly on his feet, asked if there was anybody present who was a veteran. And we had probably about 10 people there who were veterans. And we asked them to tell us what service they were in, Army, Navy, Army Air Corps. There was no Air Force at that particular time. It was the Army Air Corps. And maybe something of their tenure in the military, what they did. And we were very surprised at the answers that we got. One man was there on D-Day, and he was in charge of Higgins boats bringing men to the beach and taking wounded and corpses back. And so we decided after that we were going to do it. Every time we were going to do that same thing. We would sing the British national anthem, and then one verse of a blended verse of My Country 'Tis of Thee, which is to the same tune as God Save the King. And we'd sing our national anthem, and you know we'd have all these good things that we would normally do. And our following got pretty big. And the first few years we did it, we tried to find if there were expatriate Brits here in Carteret County, and they came and participated with us. And after that, one of them, who were their tenure in North Carolina was over, and they were going back to Britain. And he said, when we get back to Britain, we're going to tell some of the newspapers they need to send somebody here to cover the that never happened. But at any rate, one thing that we would always do, we would invite the British ambassador to the United States to come here. Now, you knew he was never going to be able to come here because he's busy, you know, doing other things. And year after year, we would invite them. And finally, they called us and said, why don't you ask the British consul in Charleston, South Carolina, if he could come? But he could never come either. Well, imagine my surprise when, I think it was about 4 years ago, I got a telephone call from them about 3 weeks before the celebration. And they said, Mr. Guthrie, we're sending you something that you've asked for. And we're not going to tell you exactly what it is, but we need your mailing address. And I told them. What I had asked them for was, I said, I would love to have a British naval ensign. Do you know what an ensign is?
I'm not.
It's a flag. A British naval ensign that has flown over a Royal Navy ship, because these boys were in the Merchant Marine, which made them members of the British military. And I said, is it a Royal Navy ensign? And she said, well, I'm not going to tell you. But then she laughed, and that's what it was. And it was from a ship called HMS Dragon, Her Majesty's ship Dragon. And it was part of a reorganization of the British Navy. There are 4 component parts of the United Kingdom. There's England, there's Scotland, there's Wales, and there's Northern Ireland. And the Welsh contingent to the Royal Navy is now allowed to put a logo on the front of their ships. So HMS Dragon has a dragon on the bow of the ship, and it is part of the Welsh contingent to the Royal Navy. So that means there's now going to be a Scottish contingent to the Royal Navy, an English contingent, and a Northern Irish contingent. So anyway, we wanted to get them a thank you note. So I looked it up, and there was an address that we could send. Came back. It says undeliverable because the ship is at sea. So I tried about 4 other things. I said, well, let's try the Royal Mail. That didn't work. Let's try the Royal Navy. They said no, they couldn't do it. We tried the Foreign Office. That didn't work. And so finally I said, HMS, Her Majesty's ship. Guess what? That ship belongs to Queen Elizabeth. So why don't I send all this stuff to Queen Elizabeth and say, Your Majesty, we've been trying to get this stuff to your ship. If you can't get it to them, then I guess nobody can do it. We got a message back from her about 2 weeks later that said, all your stuff has been sent to HMS Dragon. And we got a very nice letter from the captain of the ship, and he told us when the consul had come to visit him, I said, we have a place in North Carolina who recognizes 3 British sailors that are buried there. Would you be willing to donate a Royal Navy ensign so that they can have one? They've asked for it. And he said, the captain got on the horn and said, there is a place in North Carolina that has 3 British sailors that are buried in their local cemetery. I am inclined to give them this flag. But if anybody on this ship objects, you have the next 30 minutes to come and tell me. And if you tell me that you object, I will not give them the flag. No one came, and we got the flag. So we display that flag every year at this thing. And that comprises mostly what we do for these 3 young men. But I tell their story all the time here in the museum. And if anybody else would love to hear it firsthand, I'd be happy to tell them about it. And I think that may be enough for today's podcast.
Yes, that's very good.
Maybe to sort of give you a hint for a while, some of the things that we're going to talk about are going to be the impacts that World War II made in Carteret County. We'll be discussing things like having blackout curtains and the fact that food was rationed in the United States. And that's another story that one of my father's pictures and I'll be happy to tell that one on the next podcast, because my father was in Iceland. We were not supposed to be in Iceland. And some of the pictures he took in Iceland were of the American Navy's presence in Iceland. And you say, American Navy had a presence in Iceland? We sure did. We were not in the war, but we were in Iceland. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I look forward to it.
Yes, I do too. Thank you for coming on, and we hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.